We're now going to take on one of the most hot and enthusiastic topics of the conference. We have an extraordinary panel. Our moderator, Andres Sapir, who's done a lot of work with the late Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa on issues of European structure, evolution, development, crisis. Andre, thank you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you for the invitation. Indeed, a very hot topic and a great panel. Now, the subject of this panel are the causes and consequences of the crisis in the euro area. Let me focus my brief introductory remarks on the consequences, both the consequence for the future of the monetary union and the consequences for the present resolution of the crisis. As the late Tommaso indeed rightly said, long before the crisis, the euro is indeed a currency without a state, a monetary union without a political union. And long before the crisis as well, there were two views about this state of affairs. One view that could be called the equilibrium view, and one the disequilibrium view. The equilibrium view held that a centralized monetary policy with decentralized economic policies was in principle compatible. The disequilibrium view held, on the other hand, that a currency without a state was just a temporary state of affairs, only a step towards further integration, possibly even towards political union. And that's clearly the view that Tommaso subscribed to. Now, I think there is no doubt that the crisis has shown that the equilibrium view was wrong, if only because it was illusory to believe that national governments would be willing and are able to conduct their economic policies in a way fully compatible with monetary union. Coordination is fine in theory, but very difficult or even impossible to implement in practice. But does this mean that nothing short of political union will be sufficient to ensure the functioning of monetary union? And if not, what are the boundaries of a more limited surrender of sovereignty? In a sense, this relates to a question that Ada Turner already asked in 2009 with respect to the EU in general and financial markets, when he pointed out the fundamental incompatibility between the EU, and I'm not talking simply euro area, EU-wide integrated banking market and a system of national supervision. Now, however important the issue of political union and its boundaries may be to the future of the euro area, it's clear that today we need to devote a great deal of attention to the very present situation. And I think it's clear that we need to avoid what George Soros has rightly described as the risk of a two-speed Europe and debt deflation. In fact, I think the most pressing question, the question that must be resolved in the coming months, not simply in the coming years, is how to avoid a vicious circle of high debt and low growth that Richard Koo talked about so well yesterday. And how to do this in the context of a monetary union. Now, this is fundamentally indeed a political economy question. How to distribute the burden of private and public debt in a decentralized system without a European taxpayer. Now, we have a great panel whom I'm sure will answer all of those questions. And we are going to take the panelists and discussants in the alphabetical order. I'm not going to introduce them. They are all very well known to you. So first, Carl-Ludwig.
Well, I'm very grateful for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak on this conference. I have to be quite brief, and I skipped the first part of my paper, the introduction practically, where I tried to maintain that governments have been captured by the financial industry to deregulate beyond the point which is responsible, and thus have contributed to starting off the financial crisis. But you can read that on the internet. My main point is, since rating agencies and banks are have somewhat lost their credibility, it is now important to find different criteria to judge the problem of sovereign debt or indebtedness, that likewise the judgment on that seems to be shaped by the profit-interested financial industry, especially in Europe with Greece and Ireland and Portugal and Spain maybe. Therefore, it is all the more important to search for economic history examples of similar events in order to be able to judge the consequences independently of what the rating agencies and politicians assume these days. The similar historical case that I chose is the state debt crisis of 9 US states in the 1840s. Since the 1990s, it has also attracted the attention, these state debt crises, the attention of some US economic historians to test different explanations of sovereign debt crises, namely Richard Sylla, John Wallis, and William English have done research on that. They did it with a view to the question why and under what circumstances sovereign states defaulted in the 1840s, to shed new light on the third world debt crisis of the then recent past. I will draw on this research and some older literature to address a different set of questions with relevance to the subject of this panel. Do defaults of a minority of fiscally and financially, in terms of chartering, subsidizing, and regulating banks, defaults of sovereign states within a monetary union endanger the stability of the common currency and the creditworthiness of the non-defaulting states and of the federal government, if it exists, of that union? Is a rescue operation necessary, like the one now taking place in Europe, to prevent harm from the non-defaulters? Whose interest is being served if the central government or the fiscally and financially sound member states rescue the debt-ridden states from default? You know what happened politically after the Greek debt crisis broke loose at the beginning of 2010, and the euro allegedly moved into a danger zone. However, as to the American states' defaults of the 1840s, some information is necessary. After one of the longest and most severe depressions that this country has ever experienced, I have taken this phrase from Leonard P. Ayres in his book on business cycles, has ever experienced, which had started in March 1839 in conjunction with the cessation of British capital exports to the United States. 8 states, and I have them here, and 1 territory, the territory of Florida, which turned into a state in the 1840s, out of a total of 26 states of the Union, and they then, defaulted on their government bonds between 1841 and 1843. By 1841, 19 states and 2 territories had issued bonds out of those 26 states and several territories. This means that 50% of the indebted territories did, but that the majority of the indebted states did not default. Borrowing was almost exclusively undertaken for the purpose of financing infrastructure projects in transportation, canals, turnpikes, railroads, especially in the southern states, also for the founding and financing of state-chartered banks. During the Depression, the bond market dried up in the US and abroad. Therefore, many of the infrastructure projects remained incomplete and did not generate the expected revenue. And many of the state banks failed. State governments had supported their founding by purchasing a part of their stock in return for their own bonds, which could be sold by the banks to investors in financial centers on the East Coast or in London and other European countries. As these banks had mostly been land banks, the bulk of the assets had consisted of mortgage claims, and the farmland was declining in value and did not produce the expected crops at high prices. The Depression had triggered a sharp and protected fall in those prices. A very large fraction of state debt creditors were residents of other states and of other countries, primarily Britain, where especially Baring Brothers and Rothschilds had marketed these bonds. By the end of the decade, 4 states and the then, since March 1845, state of Florida had repudiated all or part of their debts. You see it on this slide. Of the other 4 states, 2, namely Pennsylvania and Maryland, resumed their debt service fully, including interest payments on their arrears, while others, as you can see on the slide, reached settlements with their creditors. State debt in relation to gross state product in 1840-41 averaged only 9% in the non-defaulting states, but 26% in those that defaulted temporarily, and 36% in those that partially repudiated their debt. Now, question is, should the government in Washington bail out those states? This was proposed, of course, by the creditors in London and elsewhere in Europe, Holland and France. And it was also proposed by a committee of the House of Representatives that even hammered out a bill that was adopted in the House, but never made it through the Senate because of a change in government or in the Congress after elections. So they were left to themselves. Question now is, did this harm the value of the dollar? We are quite lucky that in those years of financial crisis and depression, the dollar was of gold and silver. So the exchange rate could, in principle, fluctuate. The question is now, do we, wait a minute. Yeah, here you can, by the way, see how high the spread between here Massachusetts paper and federal paper and the defaulting states, or 2 of the defaulting states, went up. here is another example of nearly defaulting states. They also had a high spread over the US government bonds and municipal bonds in Massachusetts. Here is the dollar-sterling exchange rate. Although the exchange rates were flexible in the period of unconvertibility, it doesn't change a bit. It keeps steady. So you can see when a much larger crisis hit with the Civil War, the exchange rate of the dollar depreciated on a big scale. Now here, as a comparison, we have the exchange rate of the dollar versus the euro. And we see that in the first part of last year, it depreciated quite a bit, but since then recovered. Now the question is, was this due, as interpreted by the financial industry, due to the crisis of Greek, Ireland, and these states, to the debt crisis, or did it have different causes, namely a different policy mix between the United States and Europe? I tend to think that, especially in view of the recovery that occurred since July 2010, that while the debt crisis deteriorated, I think it didn't have to do with the debt crisis, the weakening of the euro in the first half of 2010. Now, 3 minutes, okay. Now I have slides on the differences between the 1840s and last year. And of course, you can see it here, the size of the government was very different. There was a central government in the United States in the 19th century, but there is no central government now in the euro area. And the main difference is the US states were not bailed out at the time, while European states are being bailed out these days. But there are also a number of similarities, and I can tell you more about it if you ask me a question on that during the discussion, because it would be too time-consuming to do that now. But before finishing, a question arises: if it was not to save the euro, and you recall that for a long time, for example, the German government hesitated in the first months of 2010 to intervene and help out. Maybe because they saw that it wasn't really a danger for the euro. Why then did they finally commit large funds to the euro rescue system? I have gathered evidence, for example, from interview statements of Germany's finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble, that given the opposition of the German and European population against further integration in Europe, the financial crisis in general and the debt crisis of some euro member states in particular are perceived as opportunities to deepen political integration beyond monetary union. Mind you that monetary union was conceived in the early 1990s and planned to put pressure on the member states to integrate more fully, not only in the economic field, but eventually also in the political field. And the crisis, as we have heard on this conference, is always a good opportunity to push things forward. Thank you.